Gaylord Schanilec has been described as a poet, a wood engraver, a fine printer, an artist, a writer, a letterpress printer, a designer, and an illustrator. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'd like to challenge something you say on your website, which is Gaylord Schanilec has set the standard for contemporary artist books over the last 30 years. Looking at your output, I wouldn't necessarily call them artist books. They're fine press books. Why do you call them artist books?
I don't.
On the website you do.
Well, no, I don't. That was a quote from a gallery, from Groveland Gallery. It sounded good. But it wasn't me talking. I wouldn't say anything like that. Although I have to say, I came up from the literary world. I started out, poetry was my first interest, and started illustrating small press books and eventually printing. And so I have literary roots, and that led to fine press. And then the artist book movement came along mid-'80s, in the 80s, I guess. When, like the Center for Book Arts started up here right about then.
And I know the Walker has quite an impressive collection of artist books.
Oh, they do. They had a wonderful librarian named Rosemary Furtak.
I know, I interviewed her.
Did you?
I did, yeah.
Oh, she was great.
She really was, yeah. She championed those books.
She did.
When no one else would.
That's right. And she did it on a shoestring budget, too, for many years. But the artist book thing came along, and I could see that they were kind of taking the day. Not taking the day, but there was a lot of momentum behind that side of things. And I could see that to survive, I was going to have to make books that were acceptable in that realm. And so that forced me to start sort of pushing in directions that I probably wouldn't otherwise have. And I've always been uncomfortable with the word art, just in general. It's kind of a pretentious label that I've never been comfortable with. So I avoided that whole label for a long time. But, at this point, the fact that they at least find my work interesting is good.
They meaning artist book collectors?
Yeah, the artist book collectors, yeah, and other book artists.
See, the way I see it is that book artists don't necessarily concern themselves with the printed word necessarily. Anything that kind of comes to their mind that's related to a book, they can put that out, but they don't have the craftsmanship.
That's right. And there are a number of us other people that came to it probably from the same direction I did, who maintain that craftsmanship and printing. So we're sort of called those cars that are part electric and part gasoline. We're kind of like hybrids.
Right.
We're still doing the printing, and we're still very focused on fine typography and design and materials and everything. But we're making books that aren't necessarily traditional books.
So you've been driven by the market then, to some extent.
Oh yeah. How else are you going to survive when you're kind of just doing what you want to do? You have to figure out a way to make money doing it, especially things that take as much time as this kind of work does. For me to have survived, my life is my work. That's all the time, one way or another, whatever I'm doing, it relates to the work I'm doing. But it takes that kind of commitment to make a living at it, and you have to pay attention to the marketplace. You mentioned John Randall earlier. When he prints a book, generally there's probably 4 different editions, 4 different sort of states of the book, because he's sort of identified over the years, I can sell this many books to this people for this price, and that's kind of the way that we all have to think to some degree.
So you mean deluxe edition down to the standard edition then?
Yeah,
and several in between then?
It seems, yeah. And then some people have actually then played around with the idea of a trade edition that's more, like a larger press run. You're trying to sell more to the general public. That hasn't been real successful, though. I did one once, and it helped, but it wasn't. It takes a different kind of attention.
Well, it kind of defeats the purpose, too, in a sense. If you want a fine press book, that's what you're known for.
Yeah.
Why are you going to buy a trade edition of that?
Yeah, well, because the fine press book costs $1,000 and the trade edition costs $50, maybe.
Right.
You know?
The other question that I had was, I have seen you identified as a poet in a number of different places, and I heard an interview that you gave some years back that said something like you were too, scared to be a poet. This is early on, but what can you explain what you meant by that?
What I said is that I didn't have the courage for that occupation, and what first brought me to realize that was the idea of reading poetry aloud to other people. I mean, that's intensely personal stuff, and I just didn't have it in me, to do that. But beyond that, for me to survive as a printer and a book artist, or whatever you want to call me, is one thing. I mean, I can sell a book for thousands of dollars, but to make a living as a poet writing poetry is way harder, and academia is one way most people go, I suppose. But to have made my life, as a poet per se, I think would have been something I just wasn't prepared to do.
You weren't prepared to put up with the poverty.
I put up with some poverty, but yeah.
Or as you say, you're too much of a private person, if that's how you define
most poets
poetry.
Are pretty private people, though. It's amazing how when they're actually giving a public reading, they all of a sudden just turn on. Sometimes it's pretty incredible, really, I think.
Right. Yeah, and that's, of course, assuming that at least some of the poetry is based on personal experience.
Yeah, but doesn't it kind of have to be?
Well, that's a question that many have asked, and I think T.S. Eliot said that a poem should be impersonal.
Oh, really?
Or a poet.
Oh.
Again, I might be mixing things up about why he said that, but...
Well, there are different ways of looking at everything. To me, it's extremely personal stuff.
Well, yeah, and see your own reaction to the world, right?
Yeah.
But you have written poetry over the years.
Oh, I still do. I've been writing quite a bit more poetry in the last few years.
And what motivates you to do that?
Well, part of what I think the mission is of an artist or a poet or a creative person in general is you're sort of recording your life in a way. But you have to keep moving. You can't stop. I mean, for me anyway, the way that I look at things, I can't, if I start to get satisfied with a certain situation that I'm in, I become sort of dead in the water. So every big project I do, I always leap. I have to make a leap, both technically and conceptually, and just in the way I approach things too. Whether I'm writing poetry or I'm printing from tobacco or doing wood engravings or writing or setting type. I mean, all that stuff has to keep evolving and changing. And I think that, especially with craft-oriented work, the sooner you can get started, the better, because it takes a whole lifetime. There's a famous quote of some kind that a craft takes a lifetime to learn, or something like that. I know what you mean. I can't place it right now, but for me, that's really true.
Well, I've read that each book that you do is a leap into something I don't know. The exciting part is unknown, dealing with new challenges.
Yeah, that's true. I like the leap. I noticed I used it a minute ago.
Yeah.
That comes from Thomas McGrath. Are you familiar with him?
I've heard the name, and I know he was a big influence on you.
He was.
He was a poet from North Dakota,
Yes, he was. He was a great poet.
And why is he a great poet?
He just had a great life in poetry. I mean, he grew up in North Dakota. He ended up in Oxford. He was a Rhodes Scholar. Then he came back and he was in California. He was in the military for a while, and they had him writing screenplays. And he was writing these little subtle anti-war things between the lines of the screenplays he was writing. He was in Los Angeles for a while. They got blacklisted during the McCarthy years. He came back up here and taught in Moorhead, and I got to know him a little bit at that point of his life. And then he moved to the Twin Cities. But his whole life was that way. It was a constant progression. He was constantly evolving and changing. And I was lucky enough to get to know him a little bit when he was alive. And so, yeah, he's a huge influence.
But what makes him a great poet?
I don't know. To me, he was. What do you think makes a great poet?
I'm the interviewer here.
Okay.
But he did
have a good answer to that.
He had an impact on you for a reason, right?
Yeah.
Just you loved the way you put the words in front of each other?
He was somebody that I could understand and somebody that I agreed with, I think. And in one of the key things that I can't remember, was it at the beginning of Letter to an Imaginary Friend, he has this epic, is it like a 40-year-long poem, this long poem that starts in Los Angeles with the line, "From here it is necessary to ship all bodies east." And it starts from there, and it goes for like 40 years. But it seems to me there's a little quote at the beginning of Copper Canyon did a collected letter, I don't know, 20 years ago maybe. The moon stuck in my pocket is the line that he used to sort of, as a metaphor for the muse. We wouldn't leave him alone after that. He just couldn't not do the work he was doing. And one thing that he told me, early on, I had these poetic aspirations, and I'd written not a very good poem, and I printed it into a little book. And in this poem, I claim to have learned to recognize his footprints in the snow. It was like sort of a metaphor for following in his tracks. And I sent him this poem, printed in this nice little book, and he sent back a note, "Thanks for the mysterious little book." And I thought it was nice to hear from him, but I was mysterious. And I ran into him at the airport one time, and I said, "Well, thanks for the note." He said, "I like mystery. I like mystery." And that sort of made me realize that it's the space that you make between images that's interesting to me and to him. It's not necessarily, it's the things that are implied that aren't necessarily stated, which is, to me, pretty essential to the work I do, I think.
Negative capability.
Negative capability.
Yeah.
Huh. Never heard that before, but yeah, I think so.
You went to North Dakota University?
University of North Dakota, yeah.
And then you came to the Twin Cities.
Yes.
And started illustrating for small presses, and one of them was Coffee House.
Yes.
I've got a couple of those because I interviewed Alan.
Oh, you did?
Some years ago.
Oh, yeah.
Before he died. So what got you into illustrating small press books?
Well, when you grow up in North Dakota, you need to go somewhere. And this was the nearest city, so I came here. And like I was saying, I was feeling that I wasn't up for the task of becoming a poet. But my connections in the world were more in the literary community, so I moved here, and I wasn't going to make it writing poetry, so I started illustrating small press books. And at that time, so this is like the late 70s, early 80s, the literary scene was just alive, I mean, there were little presses springing up all over the place. Coffee House was one. He was down in Iowa at that time. He was toothpaste press. And all these presses were getting these little bits of money to, print these chapbooks and little books. And
from the government?
From the government. The government. There were a bunch of little governmental grants of some kind. I mean,
State government?
The state there were different foundations. I wasn't really into getting the little grants. The publishers were. My job was just to take a manuscript and read it and try and come up with some imagery that didn't necessarily illustrate the poetry. But what did you call it a minute ago?
Yeah, negative capability.
Had negative capabilities. I was always looking for something that would survive alongside the poetry. I mean, to literally illustrate poetry always made me uncomfortable because it's such personal space. So I was always looking for something that could parallel it but not interfere with it. But there was plenty of work to do. I mean, I used to do a lot of early illustration for David Wilk of the Truck Press, who started that press. He was he was in charge of the National Endowment for the Arts and Literature for a while when he left here. He's married to Janice Agee, the writer, if you know who she is. But that was all, there was just this huge synergy going on here in the late 70s through the 80s of this literary activity. So it was the perfect place for me to land and get plenty to do.
It's interesting that, because there's a Coffee House, they're still going.
They are.
And very well known small presses is Coffee House, there's Milkweed, there's Grey
Wolf, yeah.
All here in Minneapolis, I wonder why they're here.
Funding. The business community here was very, very good as far as funding literary activities. And so they all came here. And they all came here. Another one that you didn't mention that I think still survives in Moorhead, Minnesota is New Revers Press, which Bill Truesdale brought here from New York. And that was also right about at the same time. So you had these 4 little literary presses starting out, all of them, even New Rivers, I think, has actually survived to this day.
Right.
And some of them, I mean, a lot of the books that I've come across lately have been coming out of like Grey Wolf. They've been publishing a lot of amazing stuff.
Oh, yeah, they've been winning prizes.
Yes.
Yeah. Not that that's a measure of much, but...
Well, that's what they shoot for, though.
So from there, you set up Midnight Paper Sales in 1980.
Yes.
What motivated you to do that?
Well, I was living in a warehouse with a bunch of other young artists and writers and musicians, and we were all in our early 20s, I think. But the warehouse we lived in was across the street from a paper company. On the loading dock, they had these scrap bins that they'd put all the offcuts from paper when they custom cut sheets. And so after dark, we'd sneak over there and we'd get paper out of the bins, all these scraps. That's where the name of the press came from. So I had the paper, and at one point, when I first moved in there, a friend of mine had rescued an old Vandercook off a loading dock on its way to the scrapyard. I mean, at that time, the printing industry was, in a big way, shifting over from letterpress to offset printing. And the letterpress stuff is heavy, it takes up a lot of space, and everybody just wanted to get rid of all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so those of us that became aware of it, it was just amazing what you could get for next to nothing. So Gary Egger, who was also in the warehouse, had salvaged this old Vandercook proofing press, and I had an illustration job I was doing. I was doing some wood cuts, and I was just getting boards from the lumberyard and cutting these images. He said, well, bring him over. We can print him on my press. And so he kind of showed me the press, and that was that.
And you fell in love with that, doing it?
The process of printing. But, he was doing prints, I was doing prints. And then one day I just took a simple piece of paper and I folded it in half, and I realized, that's a book now. And that was one of those great moments for me. All of a sudden I realized, hey, I can make books. And I ended up buying the print shop. There was this guy who printed for the Catholic Church. He did bulletins and all this stuff. And he was in the nursing home, and these two sisters who'd worked for him all these years were selling off his stuff. And Gary and I went over there, and I bought some type and a couple of presses and a paper cutter, and away I went. Started printing. But then the whole book artist thing started going. The Minnesota Center for Book Arts opened for the first time. And I got this Jerome Book Arts grant to print a book. And so I had this money to print this book. But my printing was a little on the rough side. And one of the things that the director at the center, Jim Sitter, insisted on was that I take this class from Jerry Lang of the Beeler Press. And so I took this class with Jerry, and immediately it stuck with me. Jerry showed me how to print well, the right paper, the right ink, the right impression, and it was all very simple and very basic. But up until that point, I had no idea of what fine printing was. And then all of a sudden I did. And that was a huge difference. From then on, I've been printing well. Up until that point, I didn't print so well.
Well, that's a very interesting statement, because anyone who's interested in fine press books needs to know what has been printed well and what hasn't been printed well. So yes. What's the difference?
Something that has been printed, there's a certain magic that happens when you have just the right impression and just the right amount of ink. There's a crispness of the type that isn't there otherwise. The biggest pitfalls are like slurring of the type, over inking of the type. Things aren't printing clearly.
So you're looking for crispness.
Yes. And in fact, one of the aspects of a letterpress printed letter that's unique is the halo that forms around the impression, because as the type sinks into the paper, that slope of the paper catches the light in a certain way, and it's almost like a glow that it creates.
And you want the glow, or you don't want the glow?
You do want the glow.
You do want the glow.
But you don't want too much of it.
No. Okay, so when you're evaluating a book to buy, you look for not too much glow, but a little bit of glow, or enough glow.
I suppose. I mean, although I don't really look at books to buy like that. Most of the books that for trade, I mean, I've traded a lot of fine books in my day. Usually I buy books, but the books that I buy are more are more resource books.
I'm thinking of people who can't print
who collect
like you.
fine print books.
Or are interested in them.
Well, I suppose that, I mean, the printing is very clear, and if you look at the back, you tell so much by looking at the back of the sheet when you're printing. I mean, like Barb and I doing Make Ready right now, when we pull an impression, we look at the back of that sheet, look it into the light to look at the shadows. And that's, for a fine printer of type, you're doing that too. And the rule of thumb is when you look at the back of that sheet, you want to be able to see the impression, but you don't want to be able to make out a particular letter. That's one of the little keys. But the thing about printing is that everybody who's good at it has a little different idea about it, because nobody does things quite the same, and especially when you do it again and again and again, year after year after year, you get into certain ways of doing things that are peculiar to you. And actually, I've been finding in recent years that every now and then something will come along and I'll realize that this thing that I have believed for 30 years isn't necessarily true. And I'll say, well, maybe I'll try it a little differently. And there are so many different ways to do it.
Of the works that you've produced, and there's over 40 books that you've produced, at least I read that somewhere.
That's probably about right.
Do you have, I know it's difficult to choose among your children, but do you have one that you think is the best printed?
The best printed? Yeah, there was one, A House in the Country. It was in the 90s. And it was printed so well that it took me years to warm up to the book. I mean, there was nothing about it that bothered me from a printing point of view. And usually, I mean, when you're printing, you're striving for perfection that doesn't exist. And so you're always frustrated, and you're always pushing for something you cannot quite attain. But when I finished printing that book, there was nothing about it technically from a printing point of view that bothered me. And that really bothered me. I mean,
so you're never satisfied.
No,
yeah, even if it's perfect.
That was the problem with that book, I think, and it wasn't perfect. But to my mind, when I finished it, printing from a printing perspective, it felt like it was.
So what is perfect then? You're saying it's unachievable.
It's unachievable.
But it's a goal though, so you must know what it is.
It's a goal. I don't know that you do. It doesn't exist, I don't think.
What one of your books are you proudest of having produced?
Probably the Silva, because that's probably had the most influence on other people. And my book dealer friend Rulon Miller says that that's probably going to be the book I'm most well known for at the end of the day.
Your master work?
I guess so.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's true. I mean, it's a very substantial book. It's a very interesting book.
What it's about?
You don't know that one?
I do know it, but I'm
Oh, you do? Yeah, it's about trees. It's actually, I worked with Benjamin Verhoeven, who had just graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design, and his uncle Gary, who I printed with, mentioned Gary earlier. He's the one that rescued the Vandercook off the loading dock. He brought Ben by one day, and Ben had never seen a letterpress shop, and he was fascinated, so he stayed on for a 6-month internship. And at that time, I was very interested in the woods, and we just enrolled our property in a state forestry program, and so we had to agree to a sustainable forestry plan, and I was struggling with this, and Ben was doing the internship, and his dream was to do a full-scale Silva, a study of trees. And so at the end of the internship, I said, hey, Ben, why don't we go ahead and do a Silva, because we have this common interest. And
this was in Stockholm, Wisconsin?
Rural Wisconsin. We had 27 acres of woods there. And so Ben and I spent 2 years collecting specimens of all the different trees in the forest, mm-hmm. and making type-high printable blocks, both end grain and long grain, from all these different species of trees, and printing specimen prints of these specimens with the idea of making the prints look as much like the actual wood as possible. And in the meanwhile, we were both writing about it. He was doing all sorts of research about each species and writing a central text. And I was writing about the process and why we chose that tree and what we were thinking about and things like that. And that was the Silva. I guess it was about a 4-year project.
Yeah, that's the thing about your books. It's quite an investment of not only time primarily. And I think you say somewhere that time is, respecting time is an important principle. It takes time to let books come into being.
Right. You know, the book we're working on now, it's called My Mighty Journey, and it started with the Minnesota Historical Society Press approaching me to illustrate a book. And I was sort of on the fence about it, but eventually, since I was moving to the city, it made sense for me to do it. And I said, yeah, okay, I'll do it, but we can't have any set deadline for this thing because it has to, I don't know what we're going to do, I don't know what's going to happen with it, and we have to let it take its own time to evolve. And they're a commercial publisher, so that was a lot for them to agree to, but it was the one stipulation I made at the beginning. And so here we are, I guess we're about 3 years into it, we probably have another year or two before we're done. And finally we're settling on, okay, it's probably going to be a fall of 2019 publication, maybe, although I just got an email from them lately and they want to talk, so I think they're starting to think we need to set a date. But I really believe that, and more over the years, I've been able to let that happen. I've been able to let the book sort of dictate its own life, really.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Well, I'll use this book we're working on now as an example. I mean, we've been collecting materials from along the river. It's the story of St. Anthony Falls in its 12,000-year journey. It took it 12,000 years to move 10 miles from here, in this very place is where it started, to Minneapolis, where it is now. So to start out with the project, we went along the course that the falls had traveled and picked up objects.
What do you mean the course that the falls followed? What does that mean?
Well, it's the Mississippi River. So
it's not the falls. The falls have stayed put, right?
No, the falls moved. That's the point of the book.
The falls moved.
Yes.
How does that happen?
All right. The glaciers melted. Okay, the glaciers 12,000 years ago. The glaciers were melting. The water was flowing from Canada down through North Dakota, across Minnesota and the Minnesota River Valley, and just between here and Minneapolis, the Minnesota met the Mississippi River, and so then it's a huge torrent of water. And when it came here to St. Paul, there was another flow coming in from the north, and that flow from the north managed to get beneath the limestone crust and start eroding the sandstone beneath the limestone. And this is it's a huge flow of water going on, and so the limestone began collapsing into the chasm that was forming. And when it did, this gigantic waterfall started moving up the river.
So moving backwards.
Yes.
It's getting eroded.
Upriver. It's moving upriver.
Right.
And so there's a writer named John Coy who wrote this story in verse from the waterfall's perspective, describing what was going on along its shores over these 12,000 years. And that's about when human presence first came around, the Paleo-Indian period, and then on and on and on. The Europeans show up in 1680, and then things really went crazy. But the story that we're working on is that story of the waterfall's life, basically, its progression. And it's all about time. It's about 12,000 years. So time is the essential element for me, for sure.
What, if you could just identify some titles of books that collectors might want to make themselves aware of yours?
Well, the Silva. Every now and then one of those does show up on the secondary market.
They sold out a long time ago, I guess.
Yeah, it sold out pretty quickly.
And what year was that?
2008, maybe? If I had my bibliography here, I could look it up. But yeah, I think it's about then. Mayflies was the book before that. Mayflies is the one that kind of started me on this natural history thread that I've been on for 20 years, I guess now. So I did Mayflies, and then I did the Silva. And then I did a study of Lake Pepin called Lac de Pleurs, which to my mind at this point is the best book I've done. I mean, there's more of me in that book than the rest of them, I think.
Is that the one with the map in it?
Yeah, it's got this huge... Technically, it's ridiculous, that map is absolutely... It's 2 feet by 3 feet, and it's like, I don't know, maybe 6 big blocks of end grain maple, and I made all the blocks from wood, from a maple tree that I'd cut down for the Silva. I've just gotten into manufacturing the blocks to such a degree by that point that, technically there's a lot going on in that book. Plus, It's extensive text, and it's all hand set from type that I had cast and printed from for previous books in my life. And that took an incredible amount of work.
No, it took you 7 years.
Yeah, it was a 7-year project. So that's probably the book I'm proudest of, I suppose. And now the book we're working on now. And there've been a lot of little books through the years that I've really enjoyed working on. I did a series of little books. At one point I was doing a broadsides with the Hungry Mind bookstore in St. Paul, which was this great independent bookstore, no longer with us sadly. But I did a series of broadsides with them, and that introduced me to a lot of young contemporary authors. And then I started doing little books with people like Edwidge Danticat and John Dufresne and Pete Hotman, who was a National Book Award winner. A lot of really good writers. You know, and for a while it was a subscription series, and it was $100 a book, and people subscribed to that series. I can't afford to do books for $100 anymore, but at that time I had a lot of fun with those little books. So those would probably be kind of fun to collect. Robert Bly, I did one with Robert Bly, which was really interesting working with him.
What about other printers and fine press proprietors? What do you covet?
Well, actually, across the hall, there's a printer named Philip Gallo who just moved over here. And when I first moved to the Twin Cities from North Dakota in the late 70s, Jerry Lang, who I mentioned earlier, the Beeler Press, Phil Gallo of the Hermetic Press, of his press, were here. And they were sort of my mentors, the two of those guys. Well, Phil is now across the hall. He studied with Harry Duncan, who was, of his generation, a famous printer who taught at Iowa. And Phil is trained as a poet, concrete poet, who turned printer. But Harry Duncan in Iowa and Walter Hamady in Wisconsin were two of the great last generation printers. And Phil studied with Harry, and Jerry studied with Walter. So between those two guys, indirectly I learned a lot from the previous generation. So yeah, I think a lot about Phil's work. I think a lot of his work. He did a book called Found Poems, which I have a copy of, which has been very influential to me.
Why is that?
Because that book sort of made me understand that text is everywhere. It's just a question of recognizing it. There were a lot of poems in there that were fragments of overheard conversations, which he would then take the time to very thoughtfully and carefully set in metal type and print and put them in this exquisite book. And in that context, it's a whole different thing, that language is. And so for a lot of the books I was doing, particularly for a while, I still do, whether I'm finding text through interviewing someone or whether I'm finding text in, 100-year-old newspaper articles or signage or wherever the text is, the words are everywhere.
Words that are worth preserving?
That can be used, that are useful. In the context of a finally thoughtfully produced book, take on a whole new meaning. What was the question again?
Whose work do you covet?
Do I covet? Okay, Carol Lee Campbell, down in California, who is a brilliant printer. To me, she's the epitome of an artist's book. I mean, she's so sensitive. She works exclusively with poetry. She's very sensitive to her subject, to the materials, and to her work and to her life, and her work is fabulous. Russell Moret, jokingly is called Young Russell in our world, who's a brilliant printer from New York. David Esselmont down in Iowa, the Somentes Press, who I worked with in Wales, and I've been in touch with
the Greganog.
The Greganog Press, yeah. I spent a half a year there illustrating, and I don't like the term illustrating, but David wanted illustrations from Whitman's Civil War poems. So, this is a dangerous can of worms because there's so many people I could talk about. Yeah. Robin Price, she does beautiful, incredible work, and she's another one. She actually learned how to print from Gerald Lang as well. So she has that same fine printerly influence that I do. And Russell, out in New York, actually learned to print from Peter Koch out in California, who is another great contemporary printer who... You're familiar with Codex.
Yeah.
It's like the World's Fair of the book arts, and Peter was so instrumental in getting, and still is, in getting that going. But we all get together. We get together out in California every other year, and over in Manhattan now every year, and Oak Knoll was a great fair for us. And that was sort of the beginning of the fine press book fairs in this country. The late Bob Fleck started that, and now his son Robbie is...
I didn't know that he died.
He did in the last year, tragically, suddenly.
Oh.
But his son Rob is determined to carry on, so I think we're going to have an Oak Knoll Fest again next fall. And then, of course, the Oxford Fair.
And you've won some important
prizes. The Silva one. The Silva won the Greganog Prize at the Oxford Fair one year. But that's been a huge fair for all of us, too, in this world. And it is a small world. And it's a wonderful world, though, because everybody's very generous. And everybody, people aren't trying to hide their secrets. Everybody's very, very generous with their knowledge. And then there's Claire Van Vliet, who I think when we had this conversation, she didn't really buy it. But to me, she's responsible for bringing women. And not that there haven't been women involved in private press work over the years, but it's sort of a male-dominated industry. But she kind of started this whole shift into the artist book world, I think, because she brought a different kind of a tactile sensibility to the work. I mean, she was really into paper making and lithography and structures, binding structures and everything like that. But she learned printing from one of the old guys, and she was an excellent printer, and she was in that same vein that Robin and Price and myself and Russell and Carolee, and we're all based in traditional typography and fine printing. So she was a very influential person as well.
Just finally then, what about printers that are no longer with us that people may have heard of over the years? Is there anyone that you particularly admire?
Well, I already mentioned Hamady and Duncan. I'm not as familiar with the East Coast or the West Coast printers, the Grabhorns. I know the names, but I don't know their work. But there's a guy named Vance Gary that John Randall is obsessed with. Oh, I forgot to mention John. John has been one of the most influential people in my life about printing, about surviving, and about just being gracious, and about being fair, and about not overpricing things, and just he has been he's like our godfather. In fact, one year he used always just to have a party after the Oxford Fair at the Whittington, and we'd all go there. And one year after the fair, he was playing the theme from The Godfather the whole weekend I was there. It was just a little cassette recorder in his shop, and it was kind of slowing down and everything, but it was playing the whole time. But there are lots of English presses that I've been very, like the Fleece Press does incredible work. Graham Moss does amazing work up in Oldham. Sebastian Carter, of course, is a great printer. I mean, I could go on.
Yeah.
And my fear right now at this particular point of this interview is I'm going to leave somebody out.
Well, again, I've just said that you particularly covet rather than who you think is good.
Well, as far as
good.
my personal collection, it's mostly people that I've been associated with, and we just trade.
Yeah.
And I have a lot. I have a beautiful collection. I have a lot of great books from my friends.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks for coming.
I've been speaking with Gaylord Schanilec, a bookie from St. Paul, Minneapolis. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.